Chapter 17. Judy Puts Her Foot Down. Part 1. "Just as naked as the day she was born," concluded Aunt Edith, and said no more. She felt, everybody felt, that there was no more to be said. Mother looked horrified and ashamed. Uncles Tom and Brian looked horrified and amused. Aunt Jessie looked horrified and contemptuous. Norma and Amy looked horrified and smug. Winnie looked horrified and annoyed. Dad and Joe and Sid just looked plain horrified. Pat stood before this family court, with Aunt Edith's hand on her shoulder, struggling unsuccessfully to keep back her tears. Well might she cry, thought the family, but her tears were not of shame or fear, as they supposed, but of regret over something marvelously beautiful, which Aunt Edith had destroyed, something which could never be replaced. This was why Pat was crying. The realization of her enormity hadn't yet come home to her. For a week, Pat had been a lonely soul. Betts was away for a visit. Jingle and Sid were busy with haymaking, and Judy, of all things unthinkable, was away. Judy had never been away from Silverbush in Pat's recollection. Vacations were unknown in Judy's calendar. "Sure, and if I'd never work if I could find anything else to do," she would say. "But the puzzle of it is, I never can." There was trouble at the Bay Shore. Cousin Danny had broken his leg, and Aunt Frances was ill, so Bay Shore borrowed Judy from Silverbush to tide over the emergency. Pat found this especially dreadful. She missed Judy at every turn. The house had never seemed so full of her as when she was away, and even the delight of having Mother in the kitchen most of the time and helping her in all household doings did not quite compensate. Besides, Gentleman Tom was gone, too. He had disappeared the very day Judy had been whirled away to Bay Shore, and the backyard and kitchen without Gentleman Tom were lonesome places. And what would Judy say when she came home and found her cat was gone? Perhaps she would think Pat had forgotten to feed him. Pat consoled herself by working feverishly over the garden, determined that Judy should be satisfied with it on her return. Evening after evening, Pat carried pails of water to it. She liked drawing the water up. It was fun to watch the bucket going down over that oval of blue sky with her own face framed in it at the bottom of the well, and then, as the bucket struck the water, to see it all blotted out, as if a mirror had been shattered. When the last bucketful had been drawn up, Pat hung over the curb and watched the water grow slowly calm again, and Pat of the well coming back, at first very shiveringly, then more clearly, then clear and distinct once more, with just an occasional quiver when a drop of water fell from a fern. Pat loved watering the garden, giving thirsty things drink after a hot day. First of all, she always watered Judy's pets, the row of garden violets under the kitchen window, which Judy called Pink-o-my-johns, such a delightful name, and a clump of mauve and white sops and wine by the turkey house, and the pinnies by the gate. Then all the other flowers, and the roses last of all, because she liked to linger over them, especially the white roses, with the dream of gold in their hearts and the plot of pansies in a far corner that seemed to bloom for her alone. On this particular evening, Pat had been at loose ends. It had rained so heavily the night before that the garden did not need watering, and when the dim came, there was nothing to do and nobody to talk to, but it was a summer evening of glamour and enchantment and mystery, and Pat was full of it, as she ran with her hair streaming behind her through the silver birches at moon rising, until she came out on the southern side in a little glade misted over with white daisies, lying amid its bracken like a cool pool of frosty moonlight. She paused there to drink in the loveliness of the scene before her. More and more that summer of her 10th year, Pat had found herself responsive to the beauty of the world around her. It was becoming a passion within her. The moon was rising over the hill of the mist, the moon that Pat had thought, when she was a tiny tot, must be a beautiful world where all was happiness. Little pools of shadow lay here and there all over the farm, among the shorn hayfields. There was one big field of hay that hadn't been touched yet. Wind waves went over it in that misty light. Beyond it, a field where happy calves were in buttercups to their shoulders. the only living creatures in sight, if you were sure those shadows along the edge of the silver bush were shadows, and not little rabbits dancing. A warm, brooding night, a night that surely belonged to the fairies. For the moment Pat could believe in them wholeheartedly again. Some strange bewitchment entered into her and crept along her veins. She remembered a Judy story of an enchanted princess who had to dance naked in the moonlight every night of full moon in a woodland glen, and a sudden craving possessed her to dance thus in moonlight too. Why not? There was nobody to see. It would be beautiful, beautiful. Pat disrobed. There was not much to it. She was already bare-legged. Her pale blue cotton frock and 2 small undies were cast aside, and she stood amongst the shadows, a small, unashamed dryad, quivering with a strange, hitherto unknown ecstasy as the moon's pale fingers touched her through the trees. She stepped out among the daisies and began the little dance Bets had taught her. A breeze blew on her through the aisles of the shining birches. If she held up her hands to it, wouldn't it take hold of them? A faint, delicious perfume arose from the dew-wet ferns she danced on. Somewhere, far away, laughter was drifting across the night, faint fairy laughter, which seemed to come from the haunted spring. She felt as light of being as if she were really made of moonlight. Oh, never had there been such a moment as this. She paused on tiptoe among the daisies and held out her arms to let the cool fire of that dear and lovely moon bathe her slim child body. "Pat!" said Aunt Edith, with 40 exclamation points in her voice. Pat came back to earth with a shudder. Her exquisite dream was over. The horror in Aunt Edith's voice enrobed her like a garment of shame. She could not even find a word to say. "Put your clothes on," said Aunt Edith icily. Not for her to deal with the situation. That was Long Alec's job. Pat dumbly put on her clothes and followed Aunt Edith down through the silver bush and into the little parlor where the rest of the silver bushites were entertaining the Bryanites, who had run down for a call. Of course, thought Pat miserably, Norma and Amy, who never misbehaved, would have to be there to see her humiliation. "How could you, Pat?" asked Mother reproachfully. I wanted to bathe in the moonlight," sobbed Pat. "I didn't think it was any harm. I didn't think anyone would see me." "I never heard of any decent child wanting to bathe in moonlight," said Aunt Jessie. And then Uncle Tom laughed uproariously. Part 2. The punishment of Pat, which the Silverbush family thought was a very light one, considering the enormity of her offense, was to Pat the most terrible thing they could have devised. She was sent to Coventry. For a week she was to speak to nobody at Silverbush, and nobody was to speak to her, except when it was absolutely necessary. Pat lived, she could never tell how, through 3 days of it. It seemed like an eternity. To think that Sid wouldn't speak to her. Why, Sid had been the most furious of them all. Mother and Father seemed sorry for her, but firm. As for Winnie, "She looks at me as if I was a stranger," thought poor Pat. She was not allowed to play with Jingle, who came over unsuspectingly the next evening. Jingle was very indignant, and Pat snubbed him for it. "My family have the right to correct me," she told him haughtily. But she cried herself to sleep every night. On the 3rd night she went to bed sadly, after kissing all her flowers and her 2 little cats good night. Below stairs the house was full of light and laughter, for Uncle Tom and Dad were roaring in the kitchen, and Winnie was practicing her singing lesson in the little parlor, and Joe and Sid were playing grab in the dining room, and Cuddles was chuckling and gurgling with Mother on the front porch. Only she, Pat, had no part or lot with them. She was outcast. Pat woke up in the darkness and smelled ham frying. She sat up in bed. The little parlor clock was striking 12. Who on earth could be frying ham at midnight in Silverbush? Nobody but Judy. Judy must be home. Pat slipped noiselessly out of bed so as not to wake Winnie, who would not even ask what she was doing if she did. Sniffing that delectable odor, Pat crept down through the silent house. She hoped that Judy would not send her to Coventry, and she thought her heart might stop aching for a little while if she could feel Judy's arms around her. Softly she opened the kitchen door. Beautiful sight! There was dear old Judy frying herself a snack of ham, her jolly old shadow flying in all directions over the kitchen walls and ceiling as she darted about. And, was it believable? There was Gentleman Tom, sitting inscrutably on the bench, watching her. How peacefully and homey and comforting it all was. There had been anything but a peaceful scene in the kitchen 2 hours before, when Judy had arrived home and demanded if all was well with the children. When she was told Pat was in disgrace, and why, Judy, as she expressed it, tore up the turf. Such a ruckus had never been known at Silverbush. Everybody caught it. "Suppose she had been seen, Judy," protested Mother. Oh, but they didn't see her, did they?" demanded Judy scornfully. "Nobody but Aunt Edith." Oh, is it Aunt Edith?" sniffed Judy. "And it was me fine Edith that dragged her in and blew it all afore Brian and his fine lady wife, you're telling me. Sure, it was like her. It's a pity little thing like that couldn't have been hushed up in the family, and to punish the tender-hearted creature so cruel. You really ain't wise, Long Alec. A bit of a tongue-lashing might have been all right, but to keep on torturing the poor jewel for a week, and her that fond of ye all, it's telling you to your face I am, Long Alec. You don't deserve such a daughter." Well, said Long Alec, quite cowed. "I don't think it's done her much harm. We'll let her off the rest of the week." "I don't know what possessed the child to do such a thing," said Mother. Oh, it's a bit of that old French lady coming out in her, I warrant ye," suggested Judy. "Certainly it didn't come from the Quaker side," chuckled Uncle Tom. "Judy!" Pat was in Judy's arms, laughing, crying. It was a glorious 5 minutes. Even Gentleman Tom betrayed a trifle of sympathy. Finally Judy held Pat off and pretended to look stern. "I don't want to be harder on you, Patsy, but what monkey dittos have ye been a-cutting up? It's a fine yarn your dad has been spinning me of ye dancing in the bush without any clothes on." "Oh, Judy, I never saw such a moon, and I was pretending I was a bewitched princess, and Uncle Tom laughed at me. That spoiled it worst of all, Judy, and it was so beautiful before Aunt Edith came." There was some wild strain of poetry in Judy that made her understand. She hugged Pat with a fierce tenderness. Oh, I've rid the riot act to them, I'm telling you. When I get me dander up, I'm a terror to snakes. There'll be no more visiting in Coventry for ye, my jewel, but you'd better not be doing any more queer things for a while." "The trouble is, I don't think the things I do are queer," said Pat gravely. "They seem quite reasonable to me, and Aunt Edith was just ridiculous." "You never spoke a truer word. Oh, what a shock it must have been to the poor soul. She's forgotten she has any legs, that one. But you'd better be a bit careful, Patsy, and if you fail any more hankering for such bathing, just tell me, and I'll get a pitcher full of moonlight and pour it over you. And now, just sit down and have a little bit of ham with me, and tell me all that's happened. Sure, and it's good to be home again." "Oh, Judy, where did Gentleman Tom come from? He's never been here since you went away." "Are you telling me? Sure, and he was sitting on the doorstep when I got out of the Bayshore rig, looking as if he wasn't knowing where his next mouse was coming from. I'm not asking him where he's been. I mightn't be liking the answer. Anyway, here he is, and here I am, and there's a beautiful pink dress of eyelet embroidery up in me grip that your Aunt Honor sent you. It'll be one in the eye for Norma when she sees you in it." "I'm going to sleep the rest of the night with you, Judy," said Pat resolutely.